In this video, I'm going to demonstrate everything you'll ever need to know about the Razor syntax. Like I said, at first glance, Razor is cool, but it also can be a little bit confusing sometimes. I mean, when do I need to use that @ symbol, and when can I get away with not using it? And I'm going to warn you, we will have a cheat sheet review session, and it will include what we talk about here. But you're really going to get the most out of this if you either follow along and do what I'm doing right now, or if you take some notes. Because while Razor is obvious like 90% of the time, there are certain edge cases that may not be so obvious as to how they work or why they work. So again, at a very high level, Razor will allow you to switch back and forth between static HTML and dynamic C#. And there are three basic approaches to making that switch. The first approach is called inline expressions. And so, for example, we can see a good inline expression here. We started off this line, in line number 6, with static HTML. And then you see the @ symbol. We are switching contexts to using Razor to get at this property called Bob created this value. Okay, and so Razor is smart enough to know whenever your C# code ends and the HTML begins. So like, for example, right here, it knew that Bob created this value was the end of that property, and then obviously when the closing H1 tag started, it knew that as well. Now, it's also important to note that we didn't have to use a semicolon at the end of this line. If we were to use a semicolon at the end of this line, we would get the annoying semicolon then as part of our header, and we don't want that. Okay, so you don't need to use even though we're switching context in the C#, you don't have to end the line with a semicolon. And it's also important to notice that whenever you see that @ symbol in front of a variable, in front of a object's property, or even in front of a method that returns a string value, you're effectively outputting that value into the return or the response stream. So you can think of it like a console.write line if you're using a console window application where it's just going to spit out values for you. It's the same thing, except it's going to write the values into the HTTP response stream. So that's why we were able to just call viewbag.bob created this value, and what do I do with it? Just go ahead and output it. Spit it out, and then it'll be in between those two, the opening and closing H1 tags. Okay. So the second approach to switching context between C# and HTML are code block expressions. So here at the very top, you can see here's a code block expression. And basically inside of that code block, you would write C# just like you would write C# in a typical C# file. So you can pretty much do anything that you want to do there. For example, if I were to set a value here like a var value equals 1,000, and then later on I would go here and I could go value plus equals 1. All right. Now I would say this, that as you'll note, this is not a typical C# code block. So in a C# code block, variables are scoped local to the code block that they were created inside of, right? However, as you can see, I was able to create another code block later down in the code here, and I was able to access the variable that I created, this var value, and change it in some way by simply just accessing it. So it's sort of like a C# code block, but it's not really like a C# code block because, again, variables, you can reference them later on down in different code blocks. Furthermore, you can reference anything that you were to create, like this value, for example, like so. And you can even use any of the helper methods for the given type that you're using. In this case, I'm going to format this value as currency, and whoops, I'm just going to spit it out there right before we go into that car loop. All right, so here we go. The value is 1,100. So the important thing to understand here with code block expressions is that they are like C# code blocks in so much that you are writing C# You're having to use the end of line character, the semicolon, but they're not like normal C# code blocks in so much that you can define a variable in one and then reference it throughout the remainder of your code, like we did here with that value variable. All right, and then the third approach to switching between C# and HTML is called mixed expressions. So a mixed expression is really the opposite of an inline expression. Here you're going to add literal HTML markup inside of a code block expression. Okay, so here, let's create another little guy down here. Well, let's put it right here. And this is going to get very messy very quickly. So I'm just going to create a name, and then I'm going to create a day equals date time dot now dot day a week. This should give us like Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, like so. And then now if I want to print that out to screen, how do I print it out? Well, we just start writing HTML, even inside of that code block. Okay, so howdy at name. Today is at day, like so. Let's run the application just to make sure this works. Okay, so you can see that's the output we get. So there's really nothing all that exciting about a mixed expression from a syntax perspective. The Razor View engine knows what is HTML markup and what is C#. Now we're going to see some cases where we're going to have to nudge Razor in the right direction using a special symbol. You're going to see a symbol with the @ sign with a colon right next to it. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But for the most part, Razor knows how to handle these situations. Also, Razor handles conditionals and loops just fine. We saw that at work here when we were using the for each statement. We'll talk about an if statement a little bit, so let's not jump into that just too much yet. But let's move on and talk about a few edge cases and how to solve them. So here, let me paste in some code, and let me change it up here. Okay, I'm just going to paste in some code here. So you can see I'm creating a new variable called product ID. I'm setting it to 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to rely on the mixed expressions to print out the product ID, which is a combination of the word Acme, A-C-M-E, plus whatever the product ID is together. So in this case, I would expect it to output Acme 1, 2, 3. So let's see if that actually works. Okay, it did not work. It seems to be confused. It's almost as if it's treating the product ID as if it were an email address. And that's simply not what we want. Instead, what we want to do is, well, what we'll have to do is use an explicit expression. So to change this and make it work, what we'll have to do is surround the word product ID with opening and closing parentheses, and that will signal to Razor that that @ symbol was really intended to be used as a accessor into, or to flip the context rather, into C# rather than be used as an email address. And this time it will actually work the way that we wanted. Okay. Now, similarly, I can, I might run into a situation like this. Howdy, name, whoops, aren't. And what I want to do here is actually put a plural on the end of this variable day. So I want to say aren't Wednesdays great? Okay, not really, but let's just say for the sake of argument that we want to do something like that. And notice that I get a red squiggly. Why is this? Well, because it doesn't recognize the variable name days. It does know about a day variable. So how can we solve this? Well, here again, we just want to create an explicit expression. If we put the parentheses around just the variable name, then it's all going to work out just fine. And you can see aren't Wednesdays the best. Okay, so that worked out just fine. All right, so since we're talking about pluralization, that kind of takes us off in a whole other direction here. How do we pluralize for more difficult scenarios? You know, it's easy just to add the S on the name of on the end of a word, but what if I want to change the pluralization form for something a little more complicated? For example, in English, you might say, "I have two children," or "I have one child." Now, programmatically, how can I make that switch? Well, in these cases, you have a couple of choices. The first one that I want to talk about are the @helper methods. So what we can do is, let's go down to the bottom here. So I'm going to create something called an @helper. Notice that syntax highlighting will highlight the entire @helper word. It recognizes it as a keyword. And so I'm going to call this pluralize children. And then we're going to allow an input parameter of int child count. And so we're pretty much creating a helper method just like we would in C#, right? And here I might want to set child count. Well, let's do this. If, so let's return a value. So let's var value. I've already used that word. Var result equals child count equals 1. If that's the case, then just use child. Otherwise, use children. Okay, and that should work. The problem is, what do we return from this? Whoops, that should work. There we go. All right, so what have we actually accomplished here? Well, we're returning a value into a string. Now, how do we print out that string? Well, I guess we could do something like this, right? Add result, maybe? No, that doesn't seem to work. The right way to go about this is actually to use an explicit expression. So let's go ahead and surround everything here. And remember, if we just use the @ symbol, that will essentially say, go ahead and spew out your results into the result stream. So now what I can do is, let's go ahead and create one of these guys and go var child count equals 2. And then we'll go I have child count, and then we'll call pluralize children, see if we can get an IntelliSense for it, passing in @child count. All right, so let's see if this works. I have 2 children. Great. Let's change it to 1. I have 1 child. Great. Okay. Put a period on the end of that. Okay, so these @helper methods are intended to be mini methods for quick formatting of slightly more difficult situations than merely just adding, for example, an S on the end of a word. However, you can really write any valid C# in an @helper method. Let me give you a slightly more interesting example here. I'm going to define below that another helper method. I'm just going to paste it in. You can see in this case, I'm allowing the user to send in the number or the amount and what should be printed out if it's in singular form or if in plural form. And then I just allow, for example, here, let's create another one of these code blocks. The way I call it is like so. There we go. All right, and so you can see that in this case, I'm creating a crisis count of 2. And so I want to say, Mr. President, there either is 1 crisis or there are 10 crises that you must deal with immediately. Okay, let's go ahead and put a paragraph on the end of that bad boy right there, like so. Let's run it and make sure it works. And so it's a little bit of a better utility method than making a single use. There are 2 crises that you must deal with immediately. Obviously, I got to get the, I need to add a space there. But other than that, that should work just fine. Okay. All right, let's move on. Let's talk about commenting. Commenting is easy. If I want to get rid of something, I can comment it out by just using the @ symbol star, and then on the end there will be a star @ symbol. So this is a comment, and for example, if I wanted to get rid of this code that I just created, I could comment it out like that. Go ahead and get rid of this part, and then go star. Where are you, star? There you go. @ symbol. All right, so now we just commented out that section of code. That's pretty helpful. Conditional statements. Let me go ahead and paste another example here. Let's go down below that. All right, as you can see, in this case, it's a little bit more interesting. In fact, I kind of got rid of crisis count, so let's go back and... Okay, there we go. I found that variable. All right, now this is a little bit more interesting. Notice that we start with a paragraph tag and we end with a paragraph tag at the bottom, and then we have this if structure in between. Remember I said, just like the for each statement, you can access looping in conditionals, in this case a conditional statement, by merely using the @ symbol, and then once you do that, you're in the context of the if statement. So everything inside of here, from here to here, it's all expected to be C# code, unless we bail out to HTML using using HTML tags as the beginning character in that particular line of code. So this is going to work. Let me go ahead and just go ahead and print it out. We'll see this will be the very bottom one. There are 2 crises that you must deal with immediately. All right, so it found that there were 2 crises, and it printed out this span tag and then finished up that line. Now the question is, do I have to use that span tag? Well, here, let's get rid of the span and let's see what happens here. Well, you can see that I'm already running into problems here. I'm only getting red squigglies. And the fact of the matter is that, again, everything from that @ symbol if all the way down is considered to be C#, unless you begin the line with an HTML tag like we did here with the span. So what if I didn't want to use the span tag, but I still wanted to do something like that? Do I have any options? And you certainly do. And in that case, you would want to use this little special tag. Let me just print it out here. Special version of the Razor syntax. So in this case, I used, notice what we did here. I created a code block, and the indenting's a little bit off, but you can get the idea. We create a Boolean that I set to false. So if the Boolean's true, which it never is, it's always false, then display this. Actually, let me do that, like so. If not, test. If it's not false, then display this. All right. So let's go ahead and run the application, and we should just get some text at the very bottom of the page. Display this. Right. And notice that I didn't have to put a paragraph tag around it, like that. Whoops. Like that. Okay. In order to get this to work, that would work as well. Display this. Instead, like in this scenario, all I would have to do is the @ symbol and then the colon, and then we're back in business. All right, this is very good. All right, so related to this idea of having to start a literal HTML line, to start a literal HTML line of code inside of a code block with an HTML tag. Actually, Razor is smart enough to figure out a lot of these situations. So for example here, suppose I want to add the following. Now, even though now, to, and country do not start with the words, or do not start with HTML tags, because Razor is smart enough to know that they are wrapped inside of and are just multiple lines inside of a single span tag, that all is well. So let's go ahead and run the application and see what we get. You can see display this. Now is the time for all good men to come to the other country. Okay, so just another example of when we have to use the tag or this at colon symbol, and when we don't have to do it inside of the context of a code block. All right, and we've already looked at the looping and the if structures. I just wanted to point out one more time that we were able to use code snippets. So I was able to type for tab tab, and I'm in and working in a code snippet inside of a view, which is really cool. If I were to make this 10, and then I can just simply do I like that, then I would simply just be printing 0 through 9, like so, on my page. And so this works with other looping statements as well. We already saw it work with the for each. It also works with the if and the switch statement. All you got to do is just, when in doubt, just try the @ symbol in front of things and see if it works, right? Or if that doesn't work, just simply Google, for example, the while statement, MVC razor, and see if you can find a code snippet out there. All right, let's talk about escaping for one moment. Now, we said that here, like Bob at learnvisualstudio.net. Razor's smart enough to figure out that I did not want to treat this as a C# statement, but rather it knows that I'm working in the context of an email address. But what about the scenario where I want to use the strudel or the @ sign for my Twitter handle? So I want to go at Bob Tabor. All right. Now it's going to give me a red squiggly line. What's the problem? I just want to put my Twitter handle out there. Well, we need to escape that character sequence by adding a second @ symbol. All right, and then all will work just fine. All right, and then another escaping scenario is whenever you want to use a reserved keyword in C# for some other purpose. So take a look, for example, in the layout.cshtml on line number 20. We've investigated this a couple of times, but if you scroll over to the right-hand side, you'll note that there's this @ symbol in front of the word class. Well, what's really being used here is class in the context of an CSS class in an HTML tag. We wanted to add the class equals navbar brand inside of our anchor tag so that it represents it out correctly and utilizes Bootstrap's classes. However, class is a reserved word in C#, and so if we use just the word class, we're going to get a squiggly line like so. And so we can escape that by just using the @ symbol in front of that reserved word, and now Razor understands what the intent of this is. It's just an input parameter with a property. It's an anonymous object with one property, the property class, set equal to navbar brand. Okay, we'll talk about that whole line of code. It's kind of confusing, but just understand if you ever run up a situation where you need to use a C# keyword and it's giving you a red squiggly line, and you're like, well, how do I do that? Use the @ symbol. Okay, so when in doubt, use the @ symbol. That's basically how Razor works. All right, and the last thing that I want to say about Razor is that you should resist the urge to do too much inside of the view. With Razor, you have the ability to write C#, and you're given a lot of power as a result of that. However, you should always attempt to keep your business rules in your domain layer. Don't let that abstraction creep out into your presentation layer. You should strive to only have presentation logic. So any kind of logic regarding, use ifs and switches and loops and things of that nature, that's great as long as it's determining how to properly format something in the model for display to the user. If it's doing some business rule calculation or any kind of business rule, then you should definitely keep that where it belongs, and that is in your domain model. Okay, so to recap, the main idea of this lesson is that the Razor View Engine makes it really easy to switch back and forth between HTML and C#, and there are 3 typical ways to perform that switch. There's inline expressions, code block expressions, and mixed expressions. We also talked about explicit expressions, adding an opening and close parentheses around a given identifier so that we can access it. especially if it's kind of in the middle of some thicker text. We talked about @helper methods, really cool. We talked about comments and conditionals and loops. We talked about escaping the @ symbol so that we could create our Twitter handles on our web pages. And we'll probably discover a few more Razor idiosyncrasies throughout this course, but this should really cover the majority of cases that you'll face, and this is all you really need to effectively build views in ASP.NET MVC. So, awesome. All right, we'll keep going in the next lesson. See you there. Thanks.